Kate Mila-Falcha, welcome to Psychics and Psychos. I'm Irish Granny Helen, and you'll notice that I'm alone. I don't have my partner, Denise Siegel, with me, and there's a really good reason for that. We have a lot of information about the crime that I'm going to start talking about today, and Denise, she's got a child at home and she works for a living. So we decided that I would go ahead and set the scene, set the stage, and tell you the story. And then we're getting together after to do our psychic thing. So bear with us. I have a lot of information. Also, I should explain something. I read a book. Where did I put it? Oh, for heaven's sake. It's in the other room. I'll show you later. I read a book that came out very, very soon after the murders. We're doing the Idaho murders. Bryan Kohberger is the perpetrator. And we're going to start out talking about the victims. But I got my information from reading the book and then from accessing every ounce of information that I could get on the internet, on YouTube, in the newspaper. We put off doing this for a long time because there was so much analysis available that was ongoing, and I wanted to be able to get as much as possible. So I have these crazy, disorganized notes, and some of them overlap. And I've been trying for weeks to make some sort of sense out of them into a cohesive narrative. I think I've done my best. I'm going to be repeating myself, but I don't think you're going to mind too much because this is really an intriguing look into the mind of somebody very disturbed. But I always feel that when we talk about these cases, it's really important to acknowledge the victims of the crime. They really are what's most important. And this is particularly a sad story, not only because of the fact that there were 4 victims, that it happened inside their home when they were in bed asleep at night, minding their own beeswax, that they were young with a real future potential ahead of them. And it's also an alarming story because of who the perpetrator was. So instead of dancing around it, let me just get started. And I'm going to divide this up. If necessary, we'll see how much time this takes. So this murder happened on November 13th. So not that long ago, 2022. So 4 years ago, very close to the day. And it happened in Moscow, Idaho. The 4 victims were all students at the University of Idaho. And the perpetrator was a PhD student at the University of, Western Washington University in Pullman. It's only 8 miles away. They straddled the border, these 2 schools, and they were very closely tied in athletics and socializing. The students were back and forth all the time. It was a very close relationship between the 2 campuses. And one of the more astounding things about this is that the perpetrator was a PhD student in criminal justice, forensic psychology. I just, really unexpected. Okay, so let's talk about these kids. And as I said, I have a slew of notes, and there'll be some repetition, and I apologize, but it may not be a problem. So let's begin with their names. The victims were Ethan Chapin, 20 years old, who was one of a set of triplets from Mount Vernon, Washington. West Coast, not to be confused with Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. He was a sophomore in sports and recreation, like going into the sports industry. And his girlfriend, Xana Kernodle, who was 20, from Avondale, Arizona, who was a junior in the marketing major. Kaylee Goncalves, who was 21, from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, who was right in the process of graduating. She had actually tied up all her loose ends and left, was getting her degree that December in general studies, but had been gone, gotten herself a new job, making a plan to do a little bit of traveling for a month and then come back to this new job. She was only at this house where she used to live to visit her best friend who still lived there, to show her new car, stay for the weekend, big game weekend. And the fourth victim was this friend, Madison Mogen, 21, from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, who was a senior in marketing. These two girls had grown up together. They had been best friends since junior high. So all of them, well, let's go back to the beginning of the semester. 6 girls rented this house. It was quite close to campus. It was in a party area, surrounded by houses populated by students, and it was party central all the time. 6 girls rented the house, but one of them finally moved out because she had the least appealing room and didn't like it and got a better offer. So now it leaves you 5 girls. Another one left, Kaylee, to get her new job, to get her life started because she was graduating. But before she takes off on a vacation, she comes by for the weekend with her new car to show her best friend Madison and to go to the big game. And she brings her dog. She has some kind of a labradoodle or something like that. She brings her dog, and the dog went with her everywhere. Okay. So all 6 people that shared the house are not there, the original 6. There's Kaylee and Madison of the original group. There's Xana of the original group. Also in the house were 2 other girls, Bethany and Dylan. Now this house had a weird floor plan. Split level. The front looks like a 3-story house. If you approach from the back, you're going into the middle floor through sliding glass, across a deck, through sliding glass doors and into a kitchen. But it's really the second level. The bottom level, the ground floor level, is really kind of a basement apartment level. Then you've got, I guess you'd call it the main floor, but it's the second level. It's split level and weird. And 2 bedrooms are occupied on this floor with the kitchen. Xana and her boyfriend is staying with her, and Dylan in another room down the hall. Directly up the stairs, there are a couple more bedrooms. One was Madison's, one was Kaylee's, but Madison's kind of moved out. So one room's sort of empty, and the 2 girls are staying together. They're best friends. They're catching up, and they have the dog. So the house is in this really congested area of student housing with all these frats, and it's a 10-minute walk to the campus, and it's known as the party house. You can go online and you can see the police coming to the house a couple of times in the previous months because parties were raging and it was really noisy. There were noise complaints. I wrote here, there's a weird floor plan. Really difficult to describe, and even when you look at it, it's kind of hard to understand. So I want to say this. When we hear about a crime, we immediately feel vulnerable ourselves, and we're hoping that we're going to hear something right away that makes these victims different from us, and we can relax. We're not like them. This is not going to happen to us. So we look for vulnerabilities or foolish behavior on the part of the victims to explain it away. It makes us feel safer. Well, these poor kids, their lives just went under a microscope after they were killed. And I don't believe that that's necessary. You know, they were innocent victims. They were criticized for their lack of security, their online presence, their partying at the house. They were college students. I remember being a college student. It's a miracle I lived long enough to be where I am today. The risks I took and didn't even realize it. And I was a relatively quiet person. These kids were really popular and having a great time. The worst you could say about them is they were a little bit casual about locking the house. They let people in and out. Lots of people had keys. Lots of people were in and out. They had very prominent profiles on social media. But so what? A lot of kids do. That doesn't explain what happened to them. You know, the night they were murdered, all four of them were at home in their beds, minding their own business. And they became the victims of a monster. And I really think that's all we need to know. So let's see here. I want to get the story as chronologically correct as possible. There's a bit of a problem with that because the witnesses that survived were not entirely sure what they were hearing. Their sense of the timeline is not set in stone because they weren't looking, they're guessing from what they heard. So we have to be careful about our assumptions about what happened. So what happened the night of the crime? Let's start with that. We're on a school semester, November, weekend night. It's the big football game. There's been all the hoo-ha around that. Two of the girls, I believe, went to that. There's other things going on. So let's begin with that. So Ethan escorted his sister to a dance that she had to go to, left early, it ended early, and he went and met up with Xana, and they went to a party at his fraternity. Kaylee and Madison, they took a cab to a sports bar, which they very popular student bar. And Kaylee's ex used to have worked there and had a roommate who was a bartender there. And, you know, this poor guy, this poor ex-boyfriend. And, you know, there was sort of a about it. He was not there as far as anybody knows. The girls talked, socialized, and left around 1:30 in the morning. Interesting. This is on camera, CCTV. They walked to a food truck close by. They ordered some food. They talked to a few people. They got into an Uber at 2 a.m. and they went home. Ethan and Xana were home in her room. Dylan was in her room down the hall from Xana. Bethany was in her room on the bottom floor, the third floor. Kaylee and Madison went upstairs to Madison's room and they had the dog. Now, here's one of the things nobody is entirely sure of, or maybe I'm just not entirely sure of it because I've heard and read so many different sources. She had this dog. The dog was outside at some point because neighbors heard the dog. And I think one of the survivors might have heard the dog outside. And she couldn't find the dog at one point. It went outside and then it didn't come back when she called. This is problematic because there's a sense that the perpetrator may very well have been hanging around even then. Their back sliding door, you go outside the kitchen door and you'd be on a deck, and the deck had a little bit of a hill up to a parking area with trees, and there was uninhabited. It was just a parking area. And there's a strong sense that he had been watching them. We don't know for sure, but that he might have even been there and might have called the dog. So We don't know. I just thought I'd put that out there. So at some point, Kaylee and Madison are in Madison's bedroom, and Kaylee starts calling her ex. I don't know if she's drunk dialing or what, but she calls him a number of times, gets no answer, and she says to her friend Maddie, see if he answers your phone. He's not answering my phone. Maybe he'll answer your phone. So Maddie calls, and there's no answer. And so around 3 o'clock, they give up on that. Around 4 o'clock, there is a DoorDash delivery, a Burger King delivery. And at 4:12, Xana is last heard from on TikTok. So now we'll back up just a little bit. Around 3:30, from CCTV, security cameras in the neighborhood, a white car starts trolling the neighborhood, going back and forth and back and forth, seemingly aimlessly. It parks above the house, and as best anybody knows, the driver walks down the hill. Maybe he hung around up there and was bothering the dog. We don't know. But then he enters through the unmarked sliding door, and he goes immediately up to the 3rd floor. The dog barks and wakes Dylan, and she thinks she can hear it upstairs, but it's not clear, and she thinks Kaylee's playing with the dog. And she hears voices and the dog, and she thinks, you know, she's irritated. But she goes back to bed, and a little later, she hears feet going up and down the stairs. And I'm not clear because I've read different versions of this. So either before the feet go up the stairs or after the feet come down the stairs, she hears a voice that she thinks is Xana saying, there's someone here, there's somebody, you know, in the house. And she looks out and sees nothing. So she goes back to bed, tries to go back to sleep. Then she hears crying from Xana's room. And this is pretty creepy. Hang on, let me make sure I have my notes in the right order. Yeah, this is pretty creepy. She hears a man's voice say, she says later in a very disturbing tone, it's okay, I'm going to help you. She hears the dog whimpering. She hears a loud thud. She is describing this as happening around 4:17. Interesting, a neighbor's security camera picked up the thud. So she looks out again. I'm going to make sure that I have this in the right order. Yeah, she looks out of her room again, just in time to almost bump into, although she doesn't go in the hall, but right there, there's a guy coming from the direction of Xana's room, all in black, black mask on. All she can see are his bushy eyebrows. And uncertain if they made eye contact, uncertain if he even saw her, and out he goes. Well, she's kind of in a shock state by now, you know, fight or flight or freeze. She locks her door, jumps back into bed, and starts calling, texting the roommates upstairs and Xana, and is getting no answer. And she starts to text Bethany and tell Bethany that she's really worried and doesn't know what to do. She's frozen, basically in shock. And Bethany convinces her, come down to my room. So she gets up the courage and she goes running down to Bethany's room, and they lock themselves in Bethany's room, and they're kind of freaking out, and they don't quite know what to do, and they fall asleep. Now, I think it needs to be said that this roommate, Dylan, this poor girl, what a situation. She is a little bit of a chicken, and she has the reputation amongst her friends of calling Wolf, the girl who cried wolf. You know, I heard a noise outside. Now, they had really good friends who lived directly across the street, a girl and a guy. The guy's name is Hunter. I don't remember the girl's name. But there are a lot of interviews with these young people that are really incredible. There's a documentary. It's good. The documentary that's really good is the one that interviews the family and friends intensively. Anyway, they're afraid to call. They don't think that this warrants a 911 call because there's always people in and out of the house and they don't know who this guy is. You know, they have no reason. And they're uncomfortable that their roommates are not answering the phone, but at the same time, they've complained Dylan has cried wolf so often that she's afraid to actually cry wolf again. And they end up falling asleep. They're kind of in shock, you know. So in the morning, they text their friends across the street. Now, they've been putting it off for a while. They've been there. I don't know what time exactly they woke up. But they text Hunter and his girlfriend across the street and, you know, come on over and check I heard a noise. The roommates are not answering their phone. And, you know, Hunter and his girlfriend are rolling their eyes like, oh, come on, you know, this is ridiculous. So they drag their feet about going over, but they finally do go over across the street. And actually, they find Bethany and Dylan in tears, kind of shaking on the front lawn. What's going on? So Hunter leads the group upstairs and he looks in Xana's room and he actually knows immediately something's he knows because he sees Xana's body on the floor, Ethan's body on the bed. But he knows these girls are already freaked out and he doesn't want to make it worse. And so he says, call 911. Someone's passed out. He admitted later he knew she was dead. When they hear someone's passed out, they're thinking they had too much to drink and maybe it's not as bad as we're making it out to be. And so they call 911 and you can hear it's all over online. You can hear their 911 call and they don't really know what's going on and they're trying to explain themselves and they're in a state of shock and they're freaked out. And okay, I have so much stuff here. It's just nuts. So let's go to, see, I got all that. What they think happened with Xana. So Xana got this DoorDash delivery. And they think what might have happened is she comes out of the bedroom, goes down to the kitchen to get the DoorDash. And she hears a noise upstairs. He's already in. And she hears a noise upstairs. So she goes up to see what's going on. And she confronts him, basically, in the upstairs bedroom. And he actually comes down after her. And that's when you hear her crying and he's saying, I'm going to take care of you. It'll be okay. And they know for a fact that, well, they're assuming that Xana interrupted his fantasy. He was doing what he wanted to do upstairs and she interrupted it. It appears that he did not know that Kaylee would be there that weekend. He was expecting Maddie to be alone and they think she was the target. They can't get him to talk, but they think she was the target. He was unexpectedly confronted by two girls instead of one, and that wrecked his fantasy. And in the middle of him reacting in anger that his fantasy's been wrecked, it gets wrecked even worse. Xana interrupts him, and she was really the one who was the worst injured. He really took it out on her. So there was music playing and lights were on in the house. You know, it was really strange. So after he took it out on Xana, he killed Ethan in the bed. Then he sat in a chair in the bedroom. And when he exited, he passed Dylan. He goes out of the house. Dylan locks herself in her room. She keeps calling and ends up in Bethany's room. And they call their friend Hunter. And Hunter comes over and she tells him all the stuff that has happened, and he gets them to call 911. I have all these notes that are repeating things. I'm trying to go through it quickly. At one point, she says she was awakened during this whole thing by the sound of a firecracker going off and a flash. And so there's some question. Did he tase Xana? The neighbor heard the barking dog. We've talked about that. And the dog was outside barking for 45 minutes, which is really odd. But it was let in at 4:45 and it stopped barking. And when the police came, the dog was closed up in the empty bedroom upstairs. Neighbors had driven by, and they saw the front door open to the house at 9 a.m. And when they drove by again at 11, the door was shut. Okay, so we heard all this. So one of the things that is important to know that in the weeks before this crime, they were having weird things happen in the house. Kaylee saw a shadow watching her from the hill a number of times when she let the dog out. She told people she felt she was being stalked because she thought she saw somebody following her. Dylan came home one day to find the front door just lying open. That was really odd. Oh, Emily. Emily is the name of the girlfriend of Hunter. So the call they got was Dylan calling Hunter and Emily, and she said, according to them, that she had heard something last night. Something's not right in the house. Just please come over. Don't ask any questions. Just please come over. He says he had to enter the code in the door to get the door open. Now, remember, somebody came by and the door was wide open. So at 11, when that person went by in the other direction, the door was shut. When Hunter and Emily got there, it was locked with the code. They went upstairs, and he sees what he sees, makes everybody leave. And, he was very brave because he cleared the rest of the people out of the house, called 911, got them to call 911, went and grabbed a steak knife from the kitchen and started to be sure that there was nobody in the house at the time. So Bethany is telling them she was scared. She didn't know what to do. They call the police, and the rest, we know about the rest. So bear with me here while I go through these notes and make sure that we're not skipping anything really important. Okay. Friends had to punch the code. The back slider was open. Why was the dog outside barking for so long, then locked up upstairs? We don't know about some of these things. And some of them might be misremembering of people, might be neighbors who didn't really check the clock and who are making assumptions, might be the truth, but we don't know because Kohberger won't talk. So the police came, and okay, I won't describe what they found. The 911 dispatcher was blamed for the delays in people showing up and then setting up the crime scene, like getting the right detectives there and everything. But it's important to remember that they were on a skeleton staff because it was this big weekend and it was before the holidays. They were sharing help with Pullman down the road. And the police who were in Washington were covering 2 counties and Moscow. So, it was too much. Severely understaffed because of this big football weekend. And the first confused call they got was an unconscious person around 11:58 on Sunday. Sergeant Gunderson was the name of the cop on duty. He decided, well, he wasn't on duty, but he decided to go when he heard the call. He got to the house. He said it was too quiet. It was weird. He said there was a cluster of kids in shock on the front lawn, and he overheard one voice say something about dead, and he thought later in retrospect it was probably Hunter, and he smelled blood right away. The first floor, he said, was not disturbed. The second floor, there were 2 dead. The third floor, there were 2 dead. And then he found the dog unharmed, closed up in another room. Captain Roger Lanier came to the crime scene as an investigator. He notified the state police, and he had to inform the university about this, like the administration of the university. So it wasn't until 3:07 that any information went out for students on campus, which when you think about, they don't know who did this. Is there a maniac loose? Took them a while to get things together. And they did try to blame the 911 operator. It wasn't the operator's fault. But the university put out what's called a vandal alert. I think that's the name of their team, if I'm correct. It's like an amber alert, only different. It's to let people know that there's some sort of emergency situation on campus. The alert was shelter in place. Just stay where you are, lock yourself in. So there was a lot of weird stuff going on in Moscow at this time. Now, keep in mind, this is 2022. We all know what happened in 2020 and 2021. There was a lot of political dissension in the city of Moscow, and everybody had an opinion, and the police chief was under a microscope because of the position that he took. He was getting threats because of 2020, and he had problems with a pastor, Doug Wilson of Christ Church, who was quite vocal about his opposition to the restrictions that the police department was trying to put on the population because of 2020. So that had been going on for 2 years, and tempers were still flaring, but things had begun to cool down. And this was the first weekend he'd taken away since January 2020. He and his wife were 3 hours away. And so it wasn't until 6 p.m. that he even got back to town. He said it was the worst crime scene he'd ever seen, and he was really worried about a serial killer. He called the FBI right away. And a team of 40 from the FBI showed up. Yeah, I know. I hesitated because I didn't trust my handwriting. A team of 40 showed up. Also, besides that, 3 from the behavioral unit, behavioral analysis. He called the Department of Psychology on the campus to get help for the cops because it was that traumatic. But he did make a public announcement. There was no ongoing threat that he felt it was a targeted attack. So the question still remains, was he just trying to avoid panic? Did he just not believe that this kind of thing could happen on, their nice, quiet campus? The state police got involved. And, they found the knife sheath under Maddie's body, and it had DNA on it. They had eyewitnesses. Dylan was in so much shock. She shut down. People thought, why didn't she do something? Well, she was in shock. She was confused, and it confused the investigators because they weren't all familiar with how a person might react to something this traumatic. They got more than 20,000 tips. They got more than 9,000 emails, 4,575 calls, 6,000 plus digital media messages, plenty, he said, of wrong-headed malingering. People went after the guy at the food truck who tried to talk to the girls, and they shunned him. They went after the ex-boyfriend. I mean, it was ugly. It was bad. And when I say people, I mean internet, trolls. So how he could conclude there was no threat is a mystery to everybody. People should have remained vigilant immediately. So they got a lot of help from the FBI, who had software, and they could identify this car for make and approximate year. Turns out they got the year wrong, but pretty close. They put a be on the lookout. There were tens of thousands of similar cars in the area, so that was a problem. But the Washington State University campus cops saw this be on the lookout, and they went through their records. And when they went through their records, they found a car like that on a slightly different year belonging to a PhD student named Bryan Kohberger. And they were concerned, but the guys above them said, well, it's the wrong year. Don't worry about it. There was no match for the DNA in the data bank, so the guy hadn't been nabbed for anything else and DNA tested before. They tried to use genetic genealogy, and that's when they go back and they look at the DNA and they say, we don't have a suspect to match the DNA with. Let's match the DNA with all the open source DNA banks that have people working on their family tree. Let's see if we can find similarities in somebody's family tree. That is the worst oversimplification of genetic genealogy in the world, and you may quote me. So they found Kohberger's family. They matched up his DNA with his father's DNA. It was similar enough. And the FBI ID'd him as a suspect by December 11th. So that's pretty quick. They didn't tell Moscow because they decided to put Kohberger under surveillance. They needed to confirm that they had the right guy. They needed a sample of his DNA. So they started following him so that they would get something that he discarded. He was very careful. The local cops didn't know about the DNA match. They didn't know about the suspect being tracked. They lost this car for a while. And I think I have to jump to another bit of paper. Yeah. So what happened was, let's go to the chronology, the timeline here for Bryan Kohberger. So June 25th, 2022, he moves to Washington. We're going to look at his life before that, but we're still thinking about the crime right now. So he moves to Washington as a PhD student. August 2022, the school starts, the semester starts. Now, how it works is if you're a PhD student, you don't really pay tuition, but they take it out of you and work. You become a TA. You get assigned to a professor, and you teach a bunch of beginning classes, and you grade all the papers, and you interact with the students in smaller groups. It takes a load off of the professor, and it gives you teaching experience because the professor becomes your mentor. So school starts, he's a TA, and in less than a month, September 23rd of 2022, he has an altercation, verbal altercation, with his mentor, professor. And there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of the professor, which we're going to talk about, a lot of the professor talking to his superiors. They have to follow the process. They have to document everything. They're getting more and more complaints from the students. October 21st, 2022, Kohberger gets an email from the professor about his deficiencies as a TA and enumerating how he can correct them. November 2nd, he's called into a meeting with multiple faculty to be given an improvement plan. November 2nd. November 13th, the murders happen, and it should be noted that his birthday was November 21st. So what we have is it's the end of the semester. It's time for Christmas. You know, it's December before they identify him. He's having trouble in school. The murders happen. He's still having trouble in school, not academically, but interacting with students, interacting with the professor. He's very arrogant, know-it-all, misogynistic. And unbeknownst to him, we'll go back over this, but unbeknownst to him, they decide that they're going to fire him as a TA. Now, that doesn't mean he's not still a PhD student. What it means is he's a PhD student without a mentor. He won't be working with that professor. And if you don't work with the professor as your mentor, if you don't get the teaching experience, if you don't get the supervision, you can take classes, but you're never going to get your PhD without the other things. So essentially, this is it for his career as a PhD. But he does not get the letter in the mail until he's left. And he goes home to Pennsylvania for Christmas. Now, here's Christmas break. He's 28 years old. And his father comes to help him drive home. And we're going to get more into his relationship with his parents, but it's significantly weird that this happened. So they get in the car and they start to drive. And now we're on the road back to Pennsylvania. And he's in Indiana. 10:42 in the morning, a sheriff pulls Bryan and his father over. Bryan is driving, pulls him over for tailgating. He lets him go with a warning. And if you've ever watched body camera video of how police interact with most people, the politest, most deferential way you'll ever see anybody react and any cop interact is the way they interacted with two white guys. It's really remarkable. It's shocking in comparison to the usual attitude. They let him go. They give him a warning. And 9 minutes later, he gets pulled over again by a different cop. So what they don't know is that they're being trailed by the FBI in cars and overhead by an airplane. And what the FBI is afraid of is, oh my God, he's been pulled over. He's not being pulled over by FBI. And the FBI did not ask the Indiana cops to pull him over. And these two cops did not know each other. And well, they didn't know each other was pulling him over. Totally random, at least allegedly, that he was just driving badly, and two different cops noticed it, and the FBI starts freaking out. They're going to ruin our surveillance. But it wasn't the FBI that was looking at him then. So let's see here. I have to jump over. The FBI has decided that that the description that Dylan says of Kohberger sounds like it. Now, they get stopped, and what they don't really know, what nobody has told the FBI, is there's a program going on in Indiana of drug interdiction, and they're stopping all kinds of cars with out-of-state license plates. And he just randomly got pulled into this sort of a sting. And it was interesting to observe their behavior. It's all on camera, on body camera. His father, Michael, had later admitted that he was feeling real dread at this point. He thought something was up with Bryan. He didn't know what it was, but he knew something was up with him. And the police stops didn't help. And you can see that there's an atmosphere of tension in the car. And he was kind of surprised that Bryan had this icy, unemotional calm when the police pulled him over, because Michael wasn't feeling it. So at this point, they start looking at cell phone patterns. And they see that a number of times over the month or two that he's been in Pullman, or 2 months, 3 months, he's been in Pullman, he's driven back and forth to Moscow and driven around that neighborhood numerous times in the middle of the night, around that specific neighborhood. And that on the night of the crime, his phone got turned off before the crime happened. And when the car was back on the highway, his phone got turned back on. And he took a very unusual route, one that he didn't take before, back home to school. Also, he came back the morning of the murder. He came back at 9 o'clock in the morning and drove past the house. What was that all about? So, returning to the scene of the crime. So he goes home to Pennsylvania. They manage to get home with his father, and then strange things start to happen. His family observes strange things. His sister is a psychologist, and she observes him cleaning out his car, wearing latex gloves, putting his trash in Ziploc bags, and taking them out, sneaking them out in the middle of the night to put them in the neighbor's trash can. She told her father, and her father just walked away. The Pennsylvania State Troopers surveyed him, and they stole the trash. And they got the DNA sample, and it matched the genetic DNA that they had. When the police team finally broke into his house, it was at 1:30 in the morning. They found Bryan Kohberger in the kitchen in gloves, putting personal trash in Ziploc bags. And at first he was stunned. Then he became talkative and generally cooperative, denying everything. And then he shut up and demanded a lawyer. The public defender that showed up was surprised. He said Kohberger was calm. He seemed intelligent. He seemed eager to be exonerated. He said, "This is not who I am." Idaho, Moscow, the chief police announced the arrest. And the Kohberger family gets a call from Dr. Ramsfeld offering help. And Dr. Ramsland is his previous mentor for his master's program. We're going to talk about her, Catherine Ramsfeld. So the evidence, what evidence do they have? And then we're going to go back and look at his life and his psychology. But what evidence do they have? They have DNA on the knife sheath found under Maddie's body. They have video of the car rushing away. They have all the cell tower information. They have the purchase of a new knife, the original knife, and a new knife after the crime. And before the crime, the purchase of a dark blue work uniform, like one of those one-piece jumpsuit work uniforms like mechanics wear. His internet history. He identifies himself as "I'm a meat sack," which is a strong indication of someone with no self-worth. He takes a lot of pictures of himself, a lot of selfies, a picture of himself in the mirror often. He talks about not deserving to live. He complains about women students and how stupid the students are that he's working with at school. We'll talk about the trouble he has in the program. We'll talk about his past life. He has a porn history of internet searches for girls who have been, who are comatose or semi-comatose intentionally by other people. Yeah. And then there's some more stuff that we'll talk about. He also has a lot of photos of girls and friends of his in bikinis, taken without their knowledge is the point. So there was another thing. What was the other factor that was so weird? We'll get to it. I have it written probably in 50 different places. So that's, oh, I know what it was. The day after the crime, like the night of the crime, in the morning. There's a picture of him fresh out of the shower, fully clothed, and he's taking a selfie of himself in the mirror in the bathroom like that. There are also interesting pictures taken of him on hikes, which we'll talk about. So next time we'll talk about his background, and then perhaps we'll talk a bit about his family and psychology. But now, depending on when Denise and I get our alternate videos out, at least you have some background on what happened. Terrible, terrible tragedy. And the documentary about the situation spends a lot of time with the family. These families will never, it's just awful what he did. So that's that for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back, and Denise will be back, and we'll be doing our little magic. Slán go fóill, slánte.